What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where for 16 years, that's right, it's our birthday, people have been getting ideological ingredients so they can brew up a zesty faith. And two guests today, longtime friends of the pod, Dominic Crossan and Brian McLaren, are right here. This is a conversation that's a part of our ongoing class this Lent, The Historical Jesus with Dominic Crossan. And if you want to join it, go to crossanclass.com and you'll be able to access his video lectures and get invites to join the rest of the live streams and access the recordings of previous ones. But this is a fun conversation for a whole nother reason. Because Brian McLaren, who joins, is talking with Dom. And Brian is the first person who I'm happy to announce will be at Theology Beer Camp 2024. That's right, October 17th to 19th. Theology Beer Camp is going down in Denver, Colorado. If you want to get tickets right now at the cheapest price, go ahead, go get them, theologybeer.camp. That's the website. And guess what? In the next week or so, we'll be announcing more info, more details. But since he's right here on the podcast, I wanted to let you know, okay? Brian will be one of the keynoters. We got plenty more, 20 theologians, 20 podcasters, plus all hanging out with large amounts of craft beverages, fun, excitement, and we got a host of special things this year. We have we're gonna have even more music than last year. We have a team putting together arts and practice-based kinds of engagement, and and Mark Feldmeyer, the minister at St. Andrew United Methodist Church that's hosting, he said, look, Trip, I have a very, very, very well-stocked beer collection that I'm going to be bringing to the bottle share. Boom shakalaka. Anyway, Brian McLaren, Dominic Crossan, talking about Jesus and his teachings and such. Check it out. Come join at crossanclass.com. And if you love this podcast and you're like, Trip, it's your 16th birthday. Whoa. Can you drive yet? No, I can't drive yet. But I could invite you to join the Homebrewed community and help keep making this possible and available to all the people. To do that, go to homebrewedcommunity.com and sign up. You'll donate, get access to all kinds of fun stuff, and go to bed knowing you help make high-quality theological conversations available for the masses. All right, smoochy boochies. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and we are here today with Dominic Crossan and Brian McLaren. Going to have ourselves a good time because we've been sent. We've now crossed the 180 question mark of questions sent in, inspired by Dom's visual lecture series on the historical Jesus and its significance for the day, which, if for some reason you haven't gone and watched them yet and you really want to, you can go to crossanclass.com. What a convenient URL that was still available. The internet really missing out on an opportunity to direct people to the excellent teaching and work of Dom. But there are groups all over. We got 6 countries where there's different discussion groups, church groups and stuff using it, as well as thousands of people doing it on their own. And so it's quite exciting to be a part of something like this and being inspired by your excellent visual presentations, Dom, bringing your historical work from the academy for so long, your time you've spent kind of honing how to communicate to the larger audience as a scholar, but then using new technology, the visual medium, and allowing people all over the place to be able to join and engage. It's quite a treat.
Yeah.
And to get cool questions that are all coming, anticipating unpacking those with one of my favorite human beings on the planet, Brian McLaren, is just quite a bit of fun. This is what happens when Trip actually talks less than he normally does on a podcast, is it's interrupting the chance for you two to talk. So I'm going to let Brian kind of set the stage for his relationship with Dom's work, the kind of things that have stuck out to him when he was watching the lecture series, and kind of direct where the conversation's going to go. I've got a host of the biggest topics most frequently asked on a Post-it pads all next to me. And hopefully we will be stewarding a fun conversation. Those of you that are joining live in the comments, feel free to talk amongst yourselves and such. But if you have a question that gets inspired by what's going on here, or something comes up from the lecture and go, oh, what about this? Or, well, Brian in Secret Message of Jesus said this, and that's similar to Dom. Type question in caps first so I can star it to try to weave it into the questions that I already have, on the docket. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Brian to kind of set the stage for this conversation.
So listen, I've got to really restrain myself here too, Trip, because I want us to be able to get to all the questions from the folks who are part of this. But Dom, this really gives me a chance first to say happy birthday. My goodness sakes. You were one of my role models here. I want to be like you when I grow up. So, but I thought it might be fun to just tell a quick story. I come from a conservative evangelical background, and people like you and Marcus Borg were seen as really evil, wicked, dangerous people. Exactly the kind of person I later became to those people myself. So, that's right. But and so Marcus was my gateway drug to find you, Dom. And what happened is that I had found Marcus because I read the book that he and Tom Wright did together. And because of my background, I was supposed to like Tom Wright a lot more. And I like Tom enough, but I just felt Marcus sort of won my heart with his graciousness and honesty and humility in that book. And so then your book, The Last Week, came out together. And when I picked up that book, having grown up evangelical where the Bible was a really big deal, my honest feeling was I have never read a book that takes the biblical text as seriously as you two took the text. And I can't remember. It was before this that I had met a feminist biblical scholar named Joanne Badley. I don't know if either of you know Joanne, but I think she retired recently. But I heard Joanne say once, what makes a good biblical interpretation, or what makes a better biblical interpretation as opposed to a worse biblical interpretation? And her simple answer was the interpretation that takes seriously the most details of the text.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I was a lit major in college, and there was something when I heard her say that just rang so true. Yes, whether the text was composed by an individual or by a community over a period of time, the details of the text are, to have so many of them be superfluous or just filler or a waste or a distraction or insignificant made no sense. And I remember when I read The Last Week, I thought, I have never felt anyone taking the details of the text as seriously. So that became my gateway into so many of your other books that I have found super, super helpful. And maybe I'll restrain myself on so many other things I'd like to say, except to say that listening to your lectures, I see it again, the attention to the details of the text, and then doing the homework of finding what that means historically and showing the text enough respect that the Sea of Tiberias or the new capital city of Tiberias is a detail worth paying attention to. The structure of a fishing boat raised from the bottom of the lake there, and watching those details all just flower with such significance, to me, is a beautiful, beautiful gift. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, I'm going to indulge myself too. I wrote a very simple little poem the other day. This is like just one step above a haiku in length, but here it is. I do not walk on water except in winter, when ice makes the miracle more natural. To me these days, natural miracles are better, signifying lessons rather than shortcuts, calling for wisdom rather than magic. And and what I feel from your work and the work of so many others, but especially yours, with just the verve and vigor with which you write, and the intensity and passion with which you write, is the Jesus that emerges when you take the history and his setting and the economics and the politics all seriously. I just am more enthralled than ever, So at any rate, that's maybe a good place for me to stop.
Thank you so very much, Brian.
Yeah.
It's like Marcus and I had a joke between us. When all else fails, read the text.
Yes.
Read the text.
Oh my goodness.
So one of the places I thought it would be fun to begin, because there are three different people that specifically asked about Jesus' teachings in different ways, and named the parables. And Jennifer in the group asked it this way: is there a particular parable of two that sticks out to Dom that connects the context of the fishermen in the Romanization of Galilee, where that context reorients our relationship to the parable again? You did the big picture in the lecture, and you've hinted in some of our previous conversations, you've brought up parables. But Jennifer and a couple other individuals said, well, how does knowing the kind of tactile, detailed nature of the historical context help us orient ourselves differently to particular parables of Jesus?
All right. Simple answer is I can't think offhand immediately, obviously, of any parable in which Jesus says the fisherman without, or the fisherwoman without the fish. I can't think of it. There are, of course, the stories about Jesus, which are parables. I mean, I'm slightly not answering, I know, at the moment. The multiplication of the loaves and fishes. I don't think that is a literal happening. It's a parable about Jesus, and it asks who controls the fishes. And when John gets the story in John chapter 6, he doesn't know quite what to do with the fish. He's fine with the bread, because that can be symbolized. But the idea of Jesus breaking up the fish, that's messy. Of course, this is a parable about who controls the fish in the lake. This is anti-Antipas. It's not told by Jesus, it's done by Jesus. And the same with the great miraculous catch in chapter 5 of Luke, and the alternative in chapter 21 of John. Who controls the fish? So that's really where I would find it much more. I can't think of anywhere which is like the sower, the equivalent of the fisher. The only other thing I would say is that there is one parable, and only one, which is in two independent evangelical contexts. That is the mustard seed. It's in Q and it's in Mark, two independent versions. And that's a crucial parable, the tiny little one that says it's an ongoing process. Wait a minute. Isn't it supposed to be Jesus, God coming and doing it for us? No, it's an ongoing process, and you have to toss in the seed yourself. So in terms of general parables, but in answer to the question, no, I don't see a parable by Jesus directly, but I do see an organic connection between the parabolic medium and the rule of God message. Mm-hmm.
Do you think of let's see, with Mark, who also asked about parables, asked if the kind of Galilean context helps us reorient maybe the way we relate to some of the debt or financial, the talents parables, the ones that involve money and day laborers and these kinds of things. When we put Jesus in that context and we see that material life that you laid out in this, the vision you talk about, like peace through distributive justice and nonviolent resistance, like how does that distributive justice element get? How does that invite us to read parables differently than maybe through the frame of civilization in kind of dominant cultural religion?
Well, it's absolutely clear. That's where I do see the connection. The classic one is the workers. The guy goes out. It's high harvest in the vineyard. He goes out at, let me see if I get it right. He goes out at 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock. and brings people into the vineyard. Then at the end of the day, he gives everyone a full day's pay. Isn't he lovely? What a lovely person. Cheapskate has gone out carefully during the day so he doesn't get too many workers. But then he does this. Now, if an audience is listening to Jesus, the lure, the seduction, the annoyance in there is then he says, why stand you here all the day idle? Well, first of all, if they're standing in the marketplace, they're not idle. They're looking for a job. If they were sitting and playing something or having a coffee or whatever, they're standing looking for a job. And this, we won't use any expletives, this guy at the end of the day says twice in this parable, even in the abbreviation of the parable, and Jesus might have talked for an hour, twice, why stand you here? That would have sent day laborers through the roof. They wouldn't have said, wasn't he so nice? He gave us all a full. They wouldn't believe a word of it, in other words. This is the one place where I can see Jesus really, really, I'm going to use a strong word, seducing the crowd. Yeah. Nobody can get this wrong. Nobody can say, well, he's telling us some sewing stuff about, be careful for the birds. It's about agriculture. No, you can't get this wrong. You're being provoked. So if I had to choose one where I see the situation very clearly, that's a situation there of probably absentee landlords, but at least in this case, the guy is there. And look what he does. He goes out, 5 times, is it? He's not so generous. Come on, all you guys in. No, he's trying to go through the day, not requiring at all. So listen to the audience. Watch them getting angrier and angrier. Because this guy is dead scared he might have too many workers. But the other side of it is he knows that at 5 p.m. and high harvest time, there's going to be guys there. He's not worried, I better get out at 5 o'clock in the morning and grab them before everyone else does. There's people looking for work who never get it. They're there at 5 o'clock. Nobody kind of is coming out at 5 o'clock. They all know that. So try and imagine, in so best we can, the audience hearing that parable, and don't make it the 4 minutes that takes Jesus or whoever, but it's an excellent text summary. Give Jesus an hour with them maybe answering and shouting at him. But if it works, there has to be reaction. If everyone passes him at the end and says, lovely parable this morning, Pastor, then he blew it. Or they blew it. Didn't work. Try it again, Jesus, somewhere else. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's really helpful. Brian, Jenny in the group said that she first got connected to any of the conversations around historical Jesus work when she read your book, Secret Message of Jesus. And that kind of gave her a context for hearing Everything Must Change, which was one of your first books that kind of raised a lot of the civilizational crises that Dom is framing here, that contrast between civilization and post-civilization, and that nature of power that gets recapitulated over time in different cultures, and the counter power that you see embodied in what Jesus said, did, endured, and such. And she asked a question as to how did you as a person of faith deal with the offense of realizing the one you've given your life to and organized around has a challenge where you're really indebted and committed to the wrong team, and wonders what kind of advice you could give, because she still struggles and is challenged by what Dom's presenting, but then going like, now what do I do? Yeah. How do I ground a response?
Yeah.
Right here.
Yeah, I'd like to say something brief about that. And then, Dom, I think I'm going to do a little setup in the volleyball court, and I'll give the ball to you. Because what that question, I think, does is it says, oh, my gosh, to take that parable of the guy paying the day laborers throughout the day, and then insulting them by making it sound like they were lazy to be sitting around doing nothing. I mean, it just makes you want to cuss, right? Yeah. And then to think, the Christian church told us that that guy represents God. The Christian church seemed to misinterpret Jesus' parable almost every single time. The Christian religion that nourished me and actually told me to take Jesus seriously seems like this group of people who, by and large, aside from a St. Francis who pops up here and someone else who pops up there, seems to just miss the point. And I mean, I suppose part of what we have to say at that moment is we at that moment feel like the people in the crowd who heard Jesus tell that parable, and we get frustrated. And then we ask ourselves, well, who can I trust? What is worth committing myself to? And that's, we're being brought to a good place at that moment. What kind of economy do I want to be part of? What kind of life do I want to live? But Dom, I'm interested how you grapple with that in your own life, especially having spent years in a monastery and so on. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. And as you know, I made two major decisions. I made the decision to enter the monastery. I made the decision to leave the monastery. In between, I made no decisions. They decided everything, send me up to be a professor, send me all over the world to get a magnificent education. Not like I could have got at Harvard, but an education of being there. Yeah. Able to be all over places like Iraq and Iran when you could do that. So they made all those decisions. So I love it. I love the monastery. I don't think I discarded that. I took it all with me. That's why Dominic, as you know, is in the middle. That's my religious name, not my civil name. John Crossan's on my passport. So I love all that stuff, and I took it with me. Now, let me put that parable of Jesus. I see it, first of all, as coming from the whole biblical Jewish tradition. I'm not surprised that that's what the prophets are doing all the time.
Yes.
And I was going to say thrilled. Let me say I was thrilled by watching people oppose them, because that confirms for me that I'm reading them right. If a prophet comes up and gives this magnificent idea of a just world and everyone says, oh, that's lovely, then I know it's bunk. It's a bit like somebody saying all men are born equal, created, with unalienable rights. And if we really took it seriously, we wouldn't let the kids learn that in school. Mm. Why would we let them, say that in school? They shouldn't know. They shouldn't know about that but it's all right. We're not taking it seriously. It's kind of like So I love the fact that I'm reading through the whole Bible up to this point, and I see it again and again and again, that this vision of distributive justice, of a world that belongs to God for everyone, is said again and again. Yeah. And I'm watching people, not evil people, I'm watching us get around it. Because otherwise the Bible wouldn't need more than the first chapter. Yeah. Basically, if you get the first chapter, the first account, made in God's image and likeness, not the crown of creation, but the Sabbath, which is about justice, you got it. Mm-hmm. So the Bible has to keep saying again and again and again and again, because we're so clever, we will admit what it says, and then we figure out how to get around it. Mm-hmm. Honestly, I kind of love that, because it both confirms that we're getting it right, they understood it, and they had to get around it. Now, when I get to Jesus then, I'm not surprised that good old Matthew, whom I like in many ways, is going to get around this. He's going to say, this is a model of God. I don't want to meet that God in the dark alley or running a vineyard, for that matter. So if you haven't put it into that matrix, the biblical matrix now, think of the historical matrix coming this way, the biblical matrix coming that way, where they cross, where the parable is. So I mean, that's a nice model too. When I put it that way, it makes sense for me. And so it's not like, oh, all of a sudden, out of nowhere comes this reading of this one parable. What have you been doing? I mean, have you been listening to biblical sermons all your life? And what were they talking about? Yeah. If you're not getting this from them, I think it would be better if we preached from Shakespeare. Honestly, we wouldn't have to skip so many parts. So, I mean, you have to say, come on now, come on, if you're taking the Bible seriously, this is where my Roman Catholic sensibility crosses my biblical exegesis, because for me it's sacramental. I didn't lose that in the Reformation. I just kind of transferred it a bit from the papacy to the Bible, maybe. So that's the way I see it. It's in that double matrix, and I'm not surprised, and that helps me very much.
Could you say a bit more about the parable example? There's continued questions in the chat, and I don't want to go past it because I think a more positive interpretation of it, is they all get a full day's wage at the end, so like the recognition of their dignity and needs, that kind of thing. But could you kind of just unpack it a bit for those that were asking follow-ups in the chat?
Okay, well, I'm going to say again, Marcus and my crack, when in doubt, read the text. That's the last verse. You have to read the whole thing. And you cannot skip the twice in this text, even in this short little abbreviation, text summary. It's like what you get in like a movie summary, one sentence that tells you about it. The parables had to give Jesus an hour. Otherwise, a cough in the crowd could have drowned out the Samaritan, the key word in that one, and nobody would get it. So give him a long time, and even to argue with the crowd. He wouldn't have got past, as soon as he said a vineyard. Now, immediately, hackles go up, vineyard owner. That's already a problem. Doesn't have for us, or it is for most of his audience. Now, there might be some slaves in there who run vineyards for an absentee master, and they're fine. Everything's lovely. It's going to talk about vineyards. We're all in for that. But basically, the crowds in general would probably be getting very nervous. Now, he goes out at 6 o'clock in the morning. That would be right at dawn. So he brings in everyone he needs for the day. But then he goes out at 9. So I don't see Jesus getting past any of those steps without somebody saying, and he finds them standing there idle. This is the classy thing we do. Why are the poor poor? They're lazy. It goes back. This is the biblical basis for that, if you will. So you have to read the text. You have to meditate on the text. You can't run all the way to the end. Hey, everyone got a day's pay. Okay. If this was happening, I suppose most of the people who got a day's pay would be happy with it and off they go. But Jesus is telling a parable. He has made up this story. So why did he make up the story? If he wanted to say God treats everyone magnificently, well, they would have yawned in his face. They've heard that, but it doesn't explain that the mess they're in if God treats everyone magnificently. So I would ask people, though, also to see what I call the organic unity between Jesus's message, that it's not about intervention, but about participation, collaboration, which was the prophet said. I don't know a single prophet that said, pray and wait for God to do it for you. I honestly don't. They kept saying what you're supposed to be doing with God, and you're not doing most of the time. So I see the parables as Jesus' way of making people participate. If they don't get the parable, what he's doing to them, then they're not going to be participating and collaborating with God. So it's intensely organic for me. I'm not saying Jesus couldn't do it any other way, but that's the way. Brian?
I would love to just offer an observation on your method here, Dom, and how your method contrasts to what a lot of us who grew up going to church were exposed to. If I could say it this way, we were so many of us, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, we were part of religious communities that had a systematic theology of certain things we were supposed to believe. And in many ways, the goal was to get us to believe that systematic theology. And every Bible story was there for us to read or hear in a sermon so that we could have the items in that systematic theology reinforced and illustrated.
Okay.
And so when we would hear that the parable of the vineyard workers in the vineyard, our goal is to say, how can we end up saying something nice about God and something bad about sin, right? So that's sort of the framework of how we were taught to read. But what your methodology of this long career has illustrated is, what if we start by saying, what would this parable have meant in its original historical, economic, sociological, psychological, political context? And now all those details of the story obviously are resonating with different things. And now our job as readers is not to figure out how can this story prove our systematic theology. Our job is to say, if I'd been standing there hearing this story told, what might I have thought? And if we, until we bring our imagination into that historical setting, what you're doing makes no sense. But at the end of the day, when we're honest to so many of these, especially Jesus parables that are so subversive, as Richard Horsley said, eventually the whole thing falls apart because, as you say, the conclusions that we make about the parable, oh, God is generous. It's hardly worth saying, and it feels like an awful big waste of time to try to make an obvious point.
Yeah. And so you knew that. In one sense, I don't want to talk too long. I was saved by my autobiography because in the Roman Catholic system, I had to get a doctorate in theology before they let me near the Bible.
Yeah.
That was the rule. You couldn't get a degree in Bible. I mean, if I went to Harvard or something, I could, but not within the Catholic system. I had to get a doctorate in divinity, DD first, then they sent me to Rome. But I had outflanked them because I'd gone to a classical boarding school, which was nothing to do with the Bible. Again, I've insisted on this. It's not an elite boarding school. I was in the wilds of Donegal, and they couldn't have a boarding school or a school in every town, a high school, so we had a central boarding school. Everyone went there. But we had 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin because it was left over by the receding tide of the British Empire. We had a British education with them gone. So I got Homer and all that stuff, and Virgil and all that stuff, and Caesar and the whole, all the usual suspects, between 11 and 16. Those are the years I was 5 years of high school. So that was there. Now, I don't mind to say anything about theology. That was conjugations and all that mess, but it was in there. Now, off I go to get my theology. Okay, but I have this stuff. Then I meet the Bible. Oh, I know these characters, some of them at least. And I was able to, when we did Homer, taught by a priest in a school run by priests, nobody said, now, don't take this literally. Don't believe in these guys. We got them as a story.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not even going to say we believe in it. What do kids do when they hear a story? This is a heck of a good story. Yeah. I'm for the Greeks, I'm for the Trojans, whatever. So it got in at a basic level that I didn't even know it was there. And it protected me that even a doctorate in theology, which actually was focusing on Genesis in many ways, made in the image and likeness of God. So I kind of got myself protected that the theology that I still came out with, you begin with history and theology is the interpretation of history. I didn't begin with theology.
Yeah.
One of the things that really stuck out to me is the thinking back to the lecture and how that this is really an example. Right towards the end of the lecture, after you've gone through the Galilee boat and the movement of thing, you ask the question: is it possible for the majority of people to experience economic depression while the market's growing?
Yeah.
Oh, that was
right.
Great.
And you can hear how that parable really picks it up because and after it you quote the line in the Psalm about all of earth being the Lord's, and then go, well, if the earth is the Lord's and all that's in it, then whose are the lakes and whose are the fishes? Or you could, in that parable, well, whose are the vineyards and who gets to decide how many people barely get by. And the only way you get sustained is by the graciousness of the landowner who really owns it and keeps all the profit. And look at this one nice one that decided to pay you a full day's wage for the last 30 minutes, right? Like, yes, in a system that's inherently perverse, that doesn't recognize all of the earth as the Lord's and everything in it, is it nicer to provide a living wage? Yes. But are we going to use an individual moral exemplar on this one occasion to justify a system of exploitation and domination?
Yeah. Yes.
And that's the part I think that's hard for American Christians to hear. For so many of us, that question of, is it possible for a majority of people to experience economic depression while the market's growing? For a long time, that experience of economic depression was something we exported to other parts of the globe. Yeah. Now we're starting to experience it increasingly, even in the middle class in America. We're starting to see the consequences of our civilizational desire and need for growth economically, its impact on not just the poor elsewhere, but our non-human neighbors and our ecological civilization. It's there. And that's why it's that's why, to me, I understand the original question. I think it was Stephanie's question to Brian, where you go, the moment you start to putting this in historical context, I have these two different feelings. One, Jesus actually has good news that could be proclaimed of an alternative world we could live and participate in, and that is freaking awesome. And I am the landowner who, on a good day, gets one party in the America to kind of give people that work half day decent wages. Yeah, and we call that success.
Yeah, and it's a terrible debate, and it is a terrible debate about charity and justice. You could say what he does at the end of the day is charity, having set a whole system of injustice. And, you know, the background of that, there is a debate among scholars, and actually against people like Horsley and myself. Everything was booming in Galilee. Of course it was booming in Galilee. Antipas' whole program was to keep booming. If he boomed enough, he might become king of the Jews like his daddy. That's what's going on. He almost made it, but he just ran out of time. So it's not like, the whole place is impoverished. Of course not. It's part of Mediterranean globalization. His fish, his garum, his fish sauce that he's making in his factories is not for sale cheap around the lake anymore. It goes straight, as I said, to Tyre and out into the Mediterranean globalization. That's the way it works. And he's getting with the system. It is, and I'm not trying to just use modern language, it's Mediterranean globalization. That's what they're up to. And he's getting with the program, like Daddy.
Yeah, if I could make a comment on that, just for the folks who are still struggling with this. If you think of it like this, you hear that parable about the vineyard owner. And at the end, you think, everybody got paid well. It's a happy ending. Everything's fine. And we can praise God for being generous and blessing people. Mm-hmm. Everything's fine. We can sit back and relax. If Jesus is the kind of person who says that, that's one kind of Jesus. Now let that settle for a minute and then think, what if Jesus tells this story to help people see that this entire economy that's happening around us is exploiting and dehumanizing and making people miserable? And there's no respect for the worker because it's almost humiliating to the guy who worked all day to then pay the other. It just shows that none of these people are worth anything. And that part of the reason Jesus would tell this story is to stir people up and make them say there is something sick and wrong about this economy. A very different Jesus. And for folks who are disturbed by a different interpretation, just step back and see those are two very, very different Jesuses. And they would result in two very, very different kinds of moral formation for us, depending on which of them we're following. And for people who right now are trying to, this is very disruptive, I can imagine, but I hope folks will let that settle before they need to solve it. They'll just feel very different Jesuses out there.
And I think almost, this is from experience of the whole Bible, we're not dealing with misreadings. we're dealing with calculated anti-readings. I see too many misreadings that always come up on the best side of the boss, as it were. How come we infallibly misread in one direction? Sometimes 50% should come up for the haves and 50% for the have-nots. Okay, that would be a fair misreading. But if every time you misread, it comes up in one direction, then I think you're misdirecting it. And that's what I learned from the Torah. And the reason the Torah has to keep Torahing for 5 books is because nobody's really following it. And the reason the prophets have to go on for 700 years is because nobody's heeding them. Otherwise, we'd have Micah, let's say, and we'd have it. When the shortest one you want to pick on. They're kind of saying the same thing. Get with the Torah and get with distributive justice. Yeah. And everyone says, oh, yeah, that's nice. Now, how do I get around it? God says the land belongs to me. You're all tenant farmers and resident aliens. Oops. I'll admit he says that, but boy, just watch me get around it. Yeah. Of course, we do it too.
So one of the questions, this is from David, but there are a couple people asking for other examples. How would Jesus what were the political events around that Jesus would likely have been familiar with? When you think of his historical context and growing up, both in connection to Rome and then the politics going on in Israel and the different factions, like what were the kind of popular reference points where people like John the Baptist and Jesus and his experience have their kind of received religious tradition generate these kind of counter political movements?
Okay. I grew up in Ireland. The British were gone. I was born in 1934. They were long gone. Most of the history that I knew well was not learned in school. It was learned from songs. Songs of rebellion. We were still talking about the 1798 rebellion. The best songs were about, 200 years old or whatever. Now, Jesus in Galilee, in Nazareth. According to Josephus, in the rebellion of 4 BCE, which was like a kind of a dress rehearsal for 66, according to Josephus, the Romans usually came down from their Syrian bases along the coast, and the staging area was Ptolemais. One legion was sent in against Sepphoris, and according to Josephus, they burned it to the ground. Now, Nazareth is a tiny little village, right next to 1.5 miles or something from Sepphoris. I cannot see from my experience, I'm projecting, that Jesus could not have grown up being told about the day the Romans came. We were singing songs, great songs, by the way. All the war songs in Ireland are great. The wars weren't, but the songs were. About the day the French came, or the day the French didn't come. Sailed into Calalis Broad Bay. We knew all that stuff. Jesus had to be. What other conversation would you be having in a small village? What do you think happened when the legions from Syria came south like a swarm of locusts and lived off the land? If you were female, you're going to be raped. If you could catch you. If there were kids enslaved, men killed. Everything. What were they living off? Legion was full complement of 5,000 to 6,000, and all the auxiliary troops from all around that came in for the loot. It would be like parched earth almost left. That had to be the subject if that happened in 4 BCE, and Jesus is born around that time. So he's growing up hearing about this. I don't know if, I can't prove he did. In other words, Jesus is not growing up thinking the Romans are mythological beasts, across the Mediterranean somewhere. They were in his backyard.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first thing I want to say before I even get to Antipas or John the Baptist or Jesus. What would he have grown up hearing about? This is the biggest thing that must ever have happened. It's an awful word for slaughter, happened. He grew up like that. He knew all about the Romans. And the question must have been then, where was God? Oh, all these lovely stories about Joshua did this and Joshua did that and David took on Goliath. Yeah, those get awful hollow, I bet, when you've really seen the Romans come through your place. I mean, what's God up to? I can't think that wasn't a dominant thought in Jesus's mind, or in Mary's mind, or in Joseph, if Joseph was still alive, which I kind of doubt, actually.
Yeah. Oh, that's helpful. Brian, in Secret Message of Jesus, let's see if I remember this well, but you talk about you use the different kind of Jewish responses to Roman imperialism to help locate Jesus and frame him, to kind of give a lens to go like, it's a secret message only because, right? I actually love the line of intentional, calculated anti-readings being so rampant. But as someone who this kind of work from scholars like Dom and Marcus and such helped you see those anti-readings and then trying to introduce it, tell us about what it was like, not just seeing it, but how would you kind of introduce and frame it where there's kind of, I don't know, a friendly reservoir of sorts to start to dig into the individual parables and stories? Because thinking of a lot of people's both questions they've sent and comments in the chat, part of it is like wanting to place a few kind of tent poles down to try to capture a different vision. Yeah.
Well, let me try to recreate that a little bit from Secret Message of Jesus. And Dom, I don't think you've ever heard me talk about this, and you may have some critiques of what I'm about to say. I'd be super interested if you do. But so here's how it sort of unfolded for me. I have a background in literature, which probably had a similar effect on me as Dom's upbringing did in the classics. And I remember thinking, gosh, these characters that get mentioned in the Gospels, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Herodians, they're a big deal. And so I'm trying to figure out how it works. And it didn't, my own theological training didn't give me anything of help except an anti-Semitic reading that made the Pharisees the bad guys about everything because of all kinds of misunderstandings that Dom is great about clarifying already in this course. But so the first thing I realized is, okay, you've got the Herodians. Obviously, they're on the side of Herod. And it feels like the chief priests are kind of working with them. And they seem to represent this establishment that's getting along very well with the Romans. And the Sadducees seem to be part of this too. And there's this whole side that seems to say the Romans are in charge. We can make a buck if we get along with them, and things are not going to go well with us if we don't. And so I said, okay, they're living by, in a sense, they're accommodating themselves to the domination story. And then you have the Zealots, and then I'd read from outside the text on the Sicarii, and they seem to represent a revolution story, a violent revolution story. If we can slit enough throats, we can get the Romans out of here. As Dom said, classic terrorism. So you have domination, revolution. I remember feeling, gosh, 80% of the headlines I read any day of the week are those two stories. And then I said, but where do the Pharisees fit in? Well, I thought, well, if they're going around condemning prostitutes and condemning a lot of different people, well, could it be because they're saying that's why we aren't free? That's why God hasn't set us free, because we've got too much sin. And they're about, if we could just purify ourselves, then God would liberate us. And so now you've got a domination story, a revolution story, a purification story. And then from outside the text, you had the Essenes and others who were fleeing out into the wilderness and just saying, to hell with all of them. Maybe may God's judgment come and wipe them all out and we'll be left. So now you have an isolation story. Yep. And then I thought, and then you've got all these rich people. They tend to be clustered in Judea, and they send their stewards up to Galilee to get their money out of them. And everything's about money, land, and economic power. That's an accumulation story. And then you have all the poor people especially in Galilee, who used to be fishermen and now they can't afford it. Now I better understand because of because of how the Sea of Tiberias is being capitalized. And they're hungry and they're thirsty and their lives are tough and they lost their land from taxes and so they're living what we might call a victimization story. They have no power and there's nobody there to help them. And so when I saw those 6 stories, I felt like that explains 99% of the headlines that I ever see. And then I thought, for Jesus to say, none of those 6 stories are you going to get you to a life you want. There's got to be another story, another kind of civilization, another way of life, not the kingdom of Caesar, the kingdom of God, not the empire of Rome, the empire of God, of heaven. There's got to be another way to imagine organizing the world. So that was sort of that sort of began to unfold for me just from reading the Bible and having somebody give me permission to think historically about what Jesus was doing.
And you're getting it all, it's all there, really. It's not that you're inventing any of it. What you're doing is constructing as thick a sociology as all of us have about the sociology we're living in today. You could say, if you're listening to the people talking on television, you could put them left wing, right wing, center, any system you want. I mean, that's where it is. I think myself, I work with the Essenes, as you said, on the left wing. They've quit. They didn't even go to the. In fact, they've changed the calendar. If you really want to say I'm against you, change your calendar. Or have the 4th of July on the 5th of July. So they've changed the calendar. They're not attending the temple. I put them in the left wing. Yeah. Right wing, of course, the Sadducees. They're the Quislings, and you don't have to demonize them. That's their job. No, I put the Pharisees in the center because all the evidence I have is the Pharisees. The Messianic Jews and the Pharisaic Jews are fighting for the center. That's why the Bible really goes after the Pharisees much more. The Sadducees only appear at the right time when Jesus is in Jerusalem. The Essenes don't even appear. Who is the big enemy? The horribles. Well, as you well know, and I well know, it's whoever you're really fighting with. Yeah. It's not the apostate, it's the heretics you worry about. And it's the heretics in your own church. So I read all the Pharisees. I'm sure the Pharisees are saying equally nasty stuff if we had them, really, at that time in the 1st century, as Matthew was saying about them. Matthew might even be an ex-Pharisee for all I know, or a Pharisee, whatever. So, I think once you get that, you understand it. Yeah. And it's not extraordinary. You really don't even, if you even do what you were describing there. Just think. You don't have to deconstruct even. Read the Bible and just think. Yeah. Ask a question. Why this? Why Pharisees? Why Jesus always fighting with the Pharisees? Are they really that evil? Well, why doesn't he just dismiss them? So a 7-year-old should be asking these questions. Why? Until he's told, don't ask any questions, just believe. But it's too late. He's 7. Reason has already kicked in.
That's great. One of the unique features both of you have emphasized is understanding really the emergence of active nonviolent resistance in Second Temple period Judaism, and Jesus obviously being a very important part, the fourth philosophy in Josephus. There were a number of questions around how that helps us understand Jesus' particular teaching, say in the Sermon on the Mount or Sermon on the Plain, the ones around turning the other cheek, praying for your enemy, and all that kind of stuff. There were questioners that said, how does this relate to, say, like what Warren Carter or Walter Wink does with the turning of the other cheek kind of form of resistance? And is there how does the historical matrix give a kind of deeper, fleshed out account of what that looks like in those particular texts?
Will I start, Brian? Then you come. Okay. Way back, we're talking about the 60s or the late 50s, early 60s of the last century. First time I read Josephus' Jewish War. I didn't even bother reading Jewish antiquity because I figured I know all that stuff. That was a mistake, because how he retells the Bible is important. Read what Josephus does on Daniel. Oh, he knows Daniel's dynamite. Okay, I'm reading him and I'm noticing, wow, everything I know about Irish history, they're already doing it. They got their terrorists. Okay, they're urban terrorists. We had rural terrorists. I'm talking about the 19th century. Everything is there. And I realized that what horrifies, what scares the living daylights out of Josephus is that the Roman Emperor might decide, okay, you've had a big war, took our best troops to put you down at a dangerous time for us, so we're going to forbid the religion. It's a forbidden religion. You're not allowed to circumcise. It's forbidden religion. That horrifies him. So he bends over backwards to say that there's no eschatology, there's no motivation for any of this that comes from religion. And the ones he really, really blows his mind are these nonviolent resistors. I mean, you think they're worse than the Sicarii. He says, if I can remember the verse, they have less blood on their hands, but more impious thoughts in their minds. Because the Sicarii understands they're assassins. That's like Julius Caesar, and they only assassinate at least, quislings. They don't terrorize people. So, okay. But the fourth philosophy, the theory and practice of non-violent resistance, not non-violence. Rome give you a medal for non-violence. Resistance. I think it was invented, as far as I know, programmatic non-violence was invented by Jews, probably under Pharisaic direction, between 6 CE, the census, and 66. That's what you do between two great rebellions. You try and think, is there an alternative? I put John the Baptist and Jesus within that tent of nonviolent resistance. That's where they get it from. They didn't invent it. It's already there in various ways, however you want to do it. So that's crucial for me. And Josephus says it's Judas the Galilean, which means he's operating in Judea, because you don't call him Galilean if he's operating in Galilee, probably. So Judas the Galilean and a Pharisee. So I would think this is under the umbrella of the Pharisees. Not everyone, maybe one group of Pharisees. So I don't think Jewish scholars and Christian scholars, let me put it this way, have taken seriously enough Josephus's whole pathology against the fourth philosophy. He doesn't even want to say, well, we don't have factions, we just have philosophies. Nice little guys talking about stuff. Not religio-political factions, which is what they were. And we have this other thing called the fourth philosophy. Now, it's kind of not traditional, but yeah, kind of is traditional. And in the Jewish war, it almost doesn't exist. But then all of a sudden he gets back and tells the truth in the Jewish antiquities, where you have to play them against one another. Oh, it's big news. I think they invented it. And Jesus didn't invent it. So that's the background to it. Nonviolent resistance, organized. And we have perfectly good examples of it all over Josephus, including Caligula's statue, which we have in Philo as well. It's huge as far as I'm concerned.
Could I add something here? Dom, I think for you, your Irish heritage, you're used to being part of a struggle that goes on for many, many generations and isn't fixed, in anybody's lifetime. And I think one of my problems as someone born and raised in the United States is our assumption is every problem can be solved very quickly.
Yeah.
And if people raised here can disabuse ourselves, or at least try to distance ourselves for a minute of the idea that we can fix things. I mean, first of all, only white people would say that, because people of color and Native Americans, the last 400 or 500 years have been, things didn't get fixed. And we have to survive another day. We have to survive another generation. And that nonviolent resistance, I think people, it would be helpful, at least I think it is for me, to understand nonviolent resistance not simply as a strategy for toppling a regime. Gandhi managed to use it to topple the Brits, right? Dr. King managed to use it, to make some progress, although we still have so far to go. But even when you don't get the victory or the situation fixed, you keep your integrity intact. You keep your identity intact. You stand for something. You don't have to sell out. You don't have to save your life and lose your soul, if I can use that language. And that's a major victory when a situation is not going to change.
Yeah. I suspect I am susceptible to it, just from my own experience. I one time said to Ed Sanders, he said, well, you're just taking the British Empire and imposing it on first century Judea from your... And I said, I'm not really against the British Empire. I have to admire an empire that gave up all of India and kept a part of Ireland. I mean, gave up Hong Kong and kept Belfast. I mean, that's a truly Celtic sense of humor. I mean, but the serious thing behind it is, yes, I understand that a small people can rise again and again and again and again and lose each time. How long does it take the legions to arrive? How long does it take the dragoons to get across the Irish Sea? Of course, you always win the first round. They're just the tripwire troops. You always win the first round. And that kills you into thinking you're going to win. So, yeah. Now, sometimes it happens that sometimes you do it and the time is right or something, and who knows? But you're quite right. The nonviolent resistance could be a strategy that might make something work at a given time. It could. And it's certainly something we have to think about very much in terms of what's going on right now in Israel.
Yeah.
What would have happened if the Palestinians had sat down in the narrow streets of Jerusalem and closed the place down? And I'm talking about the 40s or the 60s. Anyway, I mean, it's a long going way, you're right, of retaining your dignity and maintaining the resistance. Yeah. And I think we have to take it hugely important. Now, after the war, the 66 to 74, then when 51 30s, in one sense, Israel said, fine. That's why we never even know Josephus if we were dependent. There is no Jewish copies of Josephus. I mean, manuscript copies. Anyway, not even the Jewish antiquities. It's like, it never happened. We don't think that way anymore. Our holiness will be preserved in home and synagogue. It's quite understandable. But we have to read Josephus very carefully and appreciate him.
How does that help interpret like those particular teachings, like in the Sermon on the Mount, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, these kinds of things? That was a couple of the questions around what do you do with those texts, putting the kind of thicker account of this political form of engagement to the fore?
Well, Walter Wicke has already answered that. This is part of the tactics. The danger is we read them and they think, well, it's just personal tactics for me. As Jesus was like, you should act like this if it's done to you. They have to be politicized. And the huge proof for me, this is looking at a way into the next lecture, is that Jesus was crucified, but his closest friends, supporters, weren't arrested even. That's the way Rome handled somebody who was, in their view, not a violent rebel, but a non-violent one who created tumult among the people. That's their phrase, who stirred up the people. That's not non-violent resistance. So the fact that Jesus was crucified and there weren't, let's say, at least 11 other crosses, shall we say, up there, that's a big proof for me, more even than turning the other cheek or anything like that. Though I do think those terms come from Jesus. So I want to make it wider and not make it depend just on those three.
If I could add one comment, Dom, you used a word I think is super powerful, and I think you used it twice, maybe more in the lectures, but you used the word evolutionary. And I think that's another dimension sometimes of this. If a group of people are oppressed or they're part of a system that is going to be around for hundreds of years before it collapses under its own weight, if they surrender and just say, I'm just going to make a buck in this system, this is as good as it gets, then that vision of a more just world, it's gone from their life. Maybe somebody else will keep it going. I think a lot of people, they think their only choices are either I just have my personal integrity or we win. But I think the third possibility is we preserve a vision that may be preserved as a minority vision for a very long time that eventually it's like a cultural, ethical gene pool that could be the future when the current regime falls. You think of the Russian intellectuals and the Russian artists and the Russian poets who know that Putin is, whatever he is. They know what he is.
Yeah.
What do? They try to keep the resistance alive. They try to keep another vision of a different possible Russian future alive until he and his cronies are dead and gone. And because if that vision is totally wiped out, there's no hope for what can rise again later on. So,
gene pool. Yeah. When I put evolutionary in the title of this, I don't want people to think, oh, he's just using an inward kind of evolutionary. It's really religious. No, what is at stake, I might say, is civilization and its discontents, and evolution and its maybe imperatives, because I'm not certain we get away with stuff. I'm not sure. I mean, if people have, well, there's no punishments from God. Well, there are consequences. Even if there's no punishments, there still are consequences. And even if you're forgiven, there still are consequences. And the consequences can be evolutionary. So I don't see Jesus as somebody just for, Christians or even religious people. If I went in today and said, let's say I was a young person, I want to spend my life studying Plato. If I did that, say Harvard, at the philosophy, nobody would say, "What? But he's 2,500 years old. Why do you want to do that?" But if I said Jesus, that's religious. Well, no, I don't see Jesus or Paul, for that matter, as religious people. So if he ain't religious, they're not important. They have their validity outside religion. Anyone who speaks about the human race or the world is making cosmic claims. They can be totally wrong, of course, but they're still making claims. They're not just saying, well, if you're religious, this would be a nice thing to be. They're saying evolution, human species, might be at stake in these decisions. And thank you I think that's a beautiful way of saying it. You're preserving the gene pool. Because if that's gone and we take it for granted, we've never done it yet, that, well, this is the way it is. If we had taken for granted long ago that, say, the Assyrian system or the Roman system was the normalcy of civilization, but not the normalcy of human nature. So maybe there's a little distinction. My way of putting it was the normalcy of civilization is not the inevitability of human nature. The normalcy of civilization is cultural, in other words, not natural, as it were. Yeah, we can do otherwise, and then that can become an imperative for survival.
So more than one person mentioned really enjoying that contrast of the lame and the blind you did in the lecture, Dom, where you talk about tradition without traction is lame and traction without tradition is blind. And when we start to see Jesus in his historical matrix, you can see how he has both traction and tradition. And one of the questioners asked for a little to fill that out a bit and give some more context. So I'd love to let you talk a bit about it. And then let Brian respond, because his book that's about to come out, I think, is a beautiful example of what someone that's taken that seriously looks like in our present context, looking at what is it like to live in a world with doom on the agenda. And I think that would actually give like two different ways of what does that mean? How do we wrestle with it? And give those that resonated with a quite tweetable line a little more context for what you were talking about.
Okay. I'll tell you exactly how it happened. I don't think I ever said it. I don't think I ever said it in any writing. I don't remember it. But I was actually preparing the slides. And at the end of it, you want to have something, not just the last slide. You want to have some kind of a finale. And I was thinking at the time, well, I'm not saying that Jesus said anything profoundly different from the prophets. I think he's saying something profoundly different from the apocalypticists. But the prophets, I don't see any prophets saying, wait, pray, and God's going to come and do it for you. Sorry, John, I don't see it. So I think Jesus is going back to the prophets. Well, now, why is it working? I mean, if he's saying whatever he's been saying, why is it working? And that's where it came into my mind, literally, TR, tradition traction. That's how I got it. I think the TRs had something to do with the traction. And then, I wanted to... It struck me that there's a lot of classic examples of that, the blind and the lame. So, but I think you have to say that. Why did Jesus work? Now, John the Baptist didn't. John the Baptist was killed as a martyr. And as I say, I think Jesus converted. I think every bit as big as Paul, from the vision of a apocalyptic advent of Jesus, of God, where all you have to do is wait and pray. And I shouldn't say all you have to do. You're waiting for God to do it. I understand that. I understand that in the last, say, 150 years before the time of Jesus, it looked hopeless. I mean, the Assyrians and the Babylonians came and went, and then you got the Persians. There's hope. Then you got the Greeks. And, that was awful. But then you got the Romans. I mean, it's getting worse. So how are we holding on to this? God's going to do it for us. But, come on. If not now, why? If not now, when? So under the Romans, you're waiting for a big conversion. I think that's what happened really with Jesus. There's a massive conversion to this. So I've actually now forgotten what was the original question. I've just got off on a tangent here. It happens worse after 90, let me assure you, more often.
It happens way before halfway to 90 as well. So the line was you use that line, tradition without traction is lame, and traction without tradition's blind, and that Jesus has both a way of inheriting the tradition and of having it find traction in his time of crisis.
And obviously it's the fishing situation. That's why he moves, obviously, from inland to the lake. He wants to be where the action is, and it's a safe place to be. So I think the tradition is there, but the traction is seeing what Antipas is doing. And all of that makes huge sense to me. The Herodian succession, some people said, well, they weren't interested in that stuff. If you don't see the problem with Antipas as the man who would be king, he just wants to get to be his father. He wants to be king of the Jews. That's a Roman given title. Everything he's doing is making sense. I look, dear Rome, how good I did a job in Galilee, upped my tax base hugely, make me king of the Jews, and I think how good I do. I mean, it makes absolute sense. That, however, gives Jesus traction in Galilee, because he can say to these people, well, do you think what happened to you when you used to be able to go down and toss a net into the sea, when you could have a boat, no matter how battered? Do you think it's fair? Do you think it's just what's happening? And they're going to say, like the Robin Hoods in a way, when the forest is no longer available, that's not fair. Because we were used to a world in which we were allowed to do that. Now, who changed the world? Now, wait a minute. If the world can change for the bad, for the worse, it could change for the better too. I mean, you have to get to the point that actually in a slow-moving world, the peasant world, it can change. And if it can change for the worse, then it can change for the better. That's how rebellions start and insurrections. So that's the traction Jesus gets. That he has people listening to him. So when I read the story in Mark, make you fishers of men, it's not that they're ready to give up get a new day job. It's they know this is not right. You have a message of why it's not right, and you've plugged it into our tradition. We're listening. And we're following. That's how it starts. Now, what happens, that's another question, but that's how you get started. Otherwise, you don't get started. You're just a preacher, and everyone loves you, and you tell great stories, pat little babies, and nobody will kill you because nobody cares.
I think we're probably running short on time, Trip. I'll just say, Dom, I think that's so well said. And I think part of our current crisis is that empires they gain a huge amount of wealth for a small number of people at the top by exploiting the earth and exploiting the poor. Sorry, I didn't mean to send those hearts there.
You've been given hearts to empire, Brian.
That's right. Hearts for the poor. They exploit the earth, they exploit the poor, and they create wealth for the people who already have a whole lot of it. And the relevance of this to our situation is a big deal. I've wondered, especially, Dom, after hearing what you were saying about Tiberius and the big money to be made on fish. You know that when you commercialize a fishery, your fish stocks go down. And to tell a story about people going out and fishing all night and catching nothing suddenly says, this is what happens when certain people are making a lot of money and lifting the GDP, but the quality of life for an awful lot of people is going down. And I just think we should feel the relevance of this to our situation, because the whole system that is operating today, well, I guess here's what I want to say. One of the things that has to happen when we watch the system stop working, when the wheels begin to fall off, is we have to develop the imagination for what that better way of life could be. If the world can change for the worse, it could change for the better. What might a better world look like? And that cultivation of vision, I'm going to guess, is one of the things that gave Jesus traction and gave his message traction. He was able to stimulate people's imagination that we can hope that someday the economy will be better and that Lake Tiberias will be restored to having a lot of fish and that more people can catch them and make a living. But we can also say that in the meantime, here's how we should treat one another to make our lives a little better and not play the game that just makes more money for the billionaires.
No, that's perfect. I mean, I don't spend much time talking about current politics, mostly because I agree with what all the critics are saying about it. I think of what this whole thing as a giant parable. If you think this is about the first century, then you'd be happy. But you missed the whole point of it. This is about how autocracy, this is a preparation for the election. This is Super Tuesday in a different format. This is what Super Tuesday looks like. This Super Tuesday looks like from the other viewpoint. This is what it is. So think of the situation as a giant parable for us now, and then try and figure, how come it works? I mean, how come I really don't have to distort it hugely to make it applicable? Am I just falsifying the whole thing? I didn't set out to do that. I mean, I set out in the 50s just to understand this stuff. Yeah. I had no idea when I started that it would have any applications beyond maybe, biblical studies or scholarship or whatever. It just kind of started taking over like a parable did.
Yes.
Whether you like it or not, then you're stuck with it.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit more about your book, though, Brian. Your new book.
Well, I'll just say, it's called Life After Doom, and I'm looking at civilization always overshooting, leading to collapse, and what happens when a global civilization begins to show the signs that it's not going to make it. And then you start to envision what are the possible futures beyond this. And so the word doom is not about the end of the world. It's the feeling that comes upon us when we realize there are no good ways out of our current situation that keep the current regime going. And then the ability, and that's why I think I'm so sensitive to Jesus' ability to give people imagination. Look, two or three of you can get together and you can have a little island of sanity and kindness, even if the rest of the world's going crazy. And 10 of you can get together on the big field and you can create a little economic unit where there'll be enough bread and fish for you to get by, even while the rest. Suddenly, so many of these things in the Gospels just feel they have a lot of salience to our current moment.
Anything else, Trip?
Oh, no. This has been, as intense of topics as we've gone through. It's also as someone who's spent a lot of time reading and talking to both of you, it's quite a bit of fun when your two nerdy friends get together and your imagination of what could happen, what happens is even more enjoyable than your fictitious ones. But not all podcasters dream about scholars talking to each other in their dreams, but this one does.
We're glad you do.
Thank you very much, Trip.
Yeah, so thank you all for being here. Remember, everyone in the group, you can respond to any of the class emails to send questions for next week, which will be focusing on the execution of Jesus. I won't spoil it. Well, I guess it did. There's an execution. But if you want to know what traction and tradition can get you when it goes to the intersection of power, we'll be exploring it next week. And we'll have another friend be joining the conversation, Jennifer Garcia Bishal, who's a wonderful New Testament scholar and spent quite a bit of time working on Rene Girard and the cross, which would be a fun conversation. And then the following week, when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, Diana Butler Bass will be joining, and that one will be a good one because Diana's already let me know the questions she wants to talk to Dom about, just so she can quote him next time someone harasses her, and telling her that she didn't believe in the resurrection, and she's like, "No, it's just ascension. That's what Dom said." So all that's headed your way. But thank you all for being here, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Great to see you, Dom.
Oh, thanks. And Brian's going to post his poem on his website. I put the link in the chat, but it's brianmclaren.net. So
thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Trevor, very much.